What do you do for a living, Dr. Couples?
I am an associate professor at the University of Iowa in the Department of Psychology. Now, working in this department has allowed me to focus much of my teachings and research on child psychology with a particular emphasis on disruptive behavior disorders such as psychopathy.
What sort of education do you have that allows you to hold this position, doctor?
I have a bachelor's in psychology, as well as a master's and PhD, both from the University of Illinois and also in psychology.
And what sort of experience do you have in your field, doctor?
Between earning my master's and PhD, I completed a one-year American Psychological Association approved internship with the Children's Hospital Medical Center in Washington, D.C. And following the completion of my PhD, I was a postdoctoral fellow for the Center of Families and Children in the Department of Psychology at the State University of New York at Buffalo.
Now, in the field of psychology, what qualifications do you have?
I am licensed to practice in the state of Illinois and Midlands. In 2012, I also received the Professor of the Year Award from the University of Iowa.
So, doctor, how are you involved in today's case?
I was hired by Miss Andy Park to assess whether Jessie Duran had any pre-existing mental conditions that it could explain why she would deliberately point a loaded firearm at Sydney Park on August 18th of 2010.
Now, when you were coming to your conclusions, doctor, did you use reliable principles and methods?
I did, yes.
And did you have sufficient facts and data?
Yes, I did.
What facts and data were you provided with?
I was provided with and analyzed the affidavits of Danny Brooks, Terry Chapin, Hayden Durant, and Andy Park. I also reviewed a copy of Jessie's deposition, as well as several of the exhibits.
And were those the only facts and data that you relied upon?
No, I also relied upon 20 interviews I conducted, three of which were with former teachers, with former babysitters, 4 of which were with former teachers, and the remaining were with fellow classmates of Jessie Duran.
And when you were coming to your conclusions, did you apply the principles and methods reliably to the facts and data of today's case?
Yes, I did.
Doctor, then tell us, what is psychopathy?
Psychopathy is a mental condition that causes people who suffer from this disorder to have a complete lack of empathy or emotion for others. They are capable of exhibiting behavior that perfectly normal people would find horrifying or baffling.
Oh, what do you mean by that, doctor?
Due to the nature of this condition, people with psychopathy have been known to lie for trivial gain or deny doing something in such a way that is so convincing that perfectly rational people would have no choice but to believe them. This could even go as far as killing someone without hesitation and later denying having done so.
Dr. Couples, do all psychopaths exhibit these traits?
Not necessarily. Most people with psychopathy are not violent, nor will they ever become involved with the law. However, it is important to note that people with psychopathy seek thrills, and the violent ones are violent because that is their chosen source of thrill.
How did you go about testing Jessie Duran?
I examined Jessie Duran through what is known the PIJ test, which stands for the Psychopathy Assessment Instrument for Juveniles.
And how did you go around testing Jessie Duran?
I tested Jessie across 10 different traits, from which I awarded a score of 2, 1, or 0, for a combined range of between 0 and 20.
And what score is needed to diagnose somebody with psychopathy?
A minimum score of 12 is required to diagnose a subject with psychopathy.
Now, of the various traits that you tested Jessie on, what does each score represent?
A score of 2 indicates that the trait clearly applies. A score of 1 indicates that the trait is only somewhat or sometimes applicable. And a score of 0 indicates that the trait never applies.
Now, out of the 8 traits that you said Jessie Duran exhibited, which were the most definitive?
The most definitive traits that Jessie Duran behavior exhibited for psychopathy tendencies were gratuitous and or guiltless lying, defiance of authority figures, and persistent aggressive behavior.
What evidence did you find to suggest gratuitous or guiltless lying in Jessie Duran?
Many interviews that I conducted, people were able to recount incidences in which Jessie was found being untruthful or lying. For instance, a former teacher recounts the incidents in which Jesse Duran falsely, insistently, but very convincingly claims that Hayden Duran, who has always worked in IT at the hospital, was in fact a retired police officer.
And what did you find to suggest defiance of authority figures?
This this trait came into effect through 2 former babysitters and 4 former teachers, who all claim to have witnessed Jesse throwing a fit or becoming very angry when asked to perform simple, ordinary tasks. Also, in my review of Andy Park's affidavit, she recounts an instance in which Jesse Duran throws a fit because Andy takes away one of her very violent video games.
Lastly, Doctor, you mentioned previous or persistent aggressive behavior. What did you find to suggest that?
Once again, many fellow classmates of Jesse, as well as teachers and babysitters, were able to recount instances of seeing Jesse violently push, kick, or punch other students. In addition, there is also the student discipline notice that was sent home by Jesse's school, as well as a picture that was drawn by Jesse Duran.
Doctor, if I were to show you a copy of the disciplinary note, would you recognize it in court today?
I would, yes.
Let the record reflect I'm approaching opposing counsel with plaintiffs 1. Permission to approach the witness with the same?
Grant, you may approach.
Doctor, what did I just hand you?
This is the notification of student discipline that was sent home by Jesse's school.
And does this appear to be a fair and accurate copy of that disciplinary notice?
It does, yes.
And does it appear to have been altered in any way?
No, it has not.
Plaintiffs moves to enter plaintiffs 1 into evidence now.
Any objections?
Not to this document, Your Honor.
Okay, so entered.
Permission to approach with a courtesy copy.
Granted, thank you.
Dr. Couples, what can you tell us about this disciplinary note?
This disciplinary note specifically indicates that this is the 3rd time that Jesse Duran is being reprimanded for showing violence towards another student. In this particular scenario, Jesse Duran is seen running over and violently kicking, punching, and even attempting to bite another student because this student would fall down and die during the game of dodgeball.
Now, Doctor, you also said that Jesse Duran had drawn a picture you'd seen.
That is correct.
Would you recognize it in court if I showed it to you today?
Yes, I would.
Let the record reflect I'm approaching opposing counsel with plaintiffs 2. Permission to approach a witness with the same?
Granted, you may approach.
Doctor, what did I just hand you?
This is the picture that was drawn by Jesse Duran while she was in school.
Does this appear to be a fair and accurate copy?
Yes, it does.
And does it appear to have been altered in any way?
No, it has not.
How do you know that this picture was drawn by Jesse Duran?
Well, first it is labeled Jesse D at the top. And secondly, when Jesse was in class that day, her teacher asked all these students to draw an adventure picture. Now, for Jesse, she chose to draw an adventure that...
Objection, Your Honor. I asked if the witness is going to talk about this document, that they attempt to enter it into evidence first.
Well, I understand the objection. I think this is an attempt at authentication as I understand it. So it's kind of towing the line, but I'm gonna allow it for now, overruled.
Yes, Your
We'll
Honor.
see where it goes.
One more time, could you please tell us how you know that this picture was drawn by Jesse?
Yes, this picture was drawn by Jesse as her name is clearly stated at the top. Now, when Jesse was in class that day, her teacher asked all these students to draw an adventure picture. Now, Jesse chose to draw an adventure of herself holding a gun and going on an adventure.
At this time, Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to move this into evidence as well.
Any objections at this point?
Yes, Your Honor. I object that this document is far more prejudicial than probative.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
According to Longstreet v. case law, Longstreet v. Floyd, this would not be more prejudicial than probative, as the probative value is that Dr. Couples used this in coming to her conclusions. Therefore, it would be extremely probative for the jury to understand fully about Jesse's psychopathic tendencies.
Okay. Give me a moment to read this case law, and then you can proceed. Okay, response?
Your Honor, while Longstreet v. Floyd is pursuant to character evidence, my objection is to more prejudicial than probative. And while it is true that Jesse created this document, there's no evidence of what age Jesse was, and the context is very minimal. And this document would unduly prejudice the jury against Jesse and inflame the passions of the jury, when really it does not give any probative value beyond what this witness can talk about with actual specific documented instances of Jesse's behavior.
I understand your concerns. I agree with her that I don't think your case law goes to her objection. It appears to be about character evidence. What's your response to more prejudicial and probative?
Once again, in determining that Jesse Duran was a psychopath, this tends to, or the probative value is that it would allow the members of the jury to fully understand to the extent of why. Therefore, the probative value is that it allows for a better understanding as to Jesse Duran's mental state on the day of the accident when Sydney Park was shot.
Okay. I appreciate your objection. I understand it. I'm going to overrule it. I think you've raised issues regarding the context of the document. I think you can explore those to cross-examination, on cross-examination to the extent that the witness, does or does not know. There is probative value. I understand the argument, but because it is probative, I'm going to allow it and overrule.
Yes, Your Honor.
Dr. Couples, what can you tell us about the picture drawn by Jesse Duran?
As I said, this picture shows Jesse going on an adventure with her and a gun. In this adventure, she is pointing it at objects, at animals, but most significantly, also at other people.
Now, Dr. DeRosa and Dr. Couples, I want to talk to you now about the final conclusion about Jesse Duran. What did Jesse Duran score on the Pi-J test?
Jesse's final score was a score of 12.
And with a score of 12, what does that mean in today's case?
A score of 12 indicates that Jesse Duran's behavior does have psychopathic tendencies.
Now, with Jesse Duran being diagnosed as having psychopathic tendencies, what does that mean?
This will have two major implications. The first is that it should not be assumed that Jesse Duran would have any difficulty subjecting Sydney harm to a great risk of harm or intentionally harming her.
And your second implication, doctor?
It is that none of Jesse's statements should be taken at face value, as one of the great hallmarks of people with psychopathy is their incredible ability to lie very convincingly. In addition, people who have been diagnosed as a psychopath have the incredible ability of determining the demeanor, words, and emotion that will be most advantageous to them in their current situation.
Thank you, Dr. Couples. At this time, there's no further questions. Permission to retrieve the evidence and send it to the bench.
You may. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Couples, as a psychological expert, you know the general consensus of the community, don't you?
I do, yes.
And the psychological community wouldn't necessarily agree with that diagnosis you just gave, would they?
There is a slight discrepancy, however, the test is reliable to use because psychopathic tendencies can be shown in the behavior of children as young as 5 years old. However, as I would agree that there is a slight discrepancy.
Well, I'd like to break down, there's actually several disagreements, and I'd like to break that down for the jury. There's actually a disagreement about whether the label of psychopathic is appropriate for anyone, isn't that correct?
Again, a few discrepancies, yes.
So yes, there's disagreement with the field.
Yes, that is correct.
And even if you agree that the label of psychopathic is appropriate, there's disagreement about whether that's appropriate to place that label on a child. Isn't that true?
Again, there is a discrepancy, however, psychopathic tendencies can be seen in children as young as 5 years of age.
But redirecting you back to my question, there's disagreement about whether it's appropriate to label a child as psychopathic.
There is, yes.
And that test that you mentioned, the Pi-J test?
Yes,
That's designed for children 12 to 16, isn't that right?
that is correct.
And at the time of the incident, so August 18th, 2010, Jesse Duran was 11 years old, isn't that right?
Yes, she was 11 at the time.
Now, I'd like to break down some of the evidence that you used for that. Well, you just brought up that comic. You don't actually know what age Jessie was when she drew that comic, isn't that right?
No, I do not.
And I'd also like to talk to you, you reviewed Andy Park's affidavit, right?
I did, yes.
And so some of the information that you got for your conclusions came from that affidavit, isn't that right?
Yes, there was.
From Andy Park's affidavit, you learned that Jesse had played violent video games.
That is correct.
From Andy Park's affidavit, you learned that when Jesse was not allowed to play those video games, that Jesse would throw fits.
That is correct.
From Andy Park's affidavit, you learned that Andy Park thought that Jesse might be bullying Sydney.
Correct.
And from Andy Park's affidavit, you learned that Sydney sometimes acted defiant in ways that she didn't when Jesse wasn't around. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
Now I'd like to go back and talk to you about that diagnosis. The score range for the Pi-J test is from 0 to 20, isn't that right?
That is correct.
And Jesse Duran scored a 12.
Yes, you did.
Now, the bare minimum to qualify for psychopathy, that's a 12, right?
It is, yes.
And you would agree with me that both the criteria and their analysis are inevitably subjective, isn't that right?
They are, and that is why we require a score of 12.
So that's a yes to my question, they're both inevitably subjective.
Yes, they are.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Thank you. Reader?
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Couples, how reliable is the Pi-J test?
Due to extensive peer review as well as experimentation, the Pi-J test has been known to be a very reliable test when determining a subject with psychopathy.
Thank you. At this time, I have no further questions.
Okay. Any recross based on that?
No, Your Honor. I ask the witness to be allowed to step down.
Okay, thank you. You're excused. Anything further?
No, Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff rests its case in chief. We only ask for a brief 5 to 10 minute recess in between case in chiefs.
Yeah, let's just take 5 if that's okay with everyone.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.